There's a detail about Abraham Lincoln that has always stayed with me. Before he became one of the most quoted presidents in history, before the Gettysburg Address reshaped American rhetoric, Lincoln was known for something far less dramatic. He rewrote constantly. He would draft speeches on scraps of paper, revisit them late into the night, cut entire paragraphs, simplify phrases, and strip away anything that felt unnecessary. The Gettysburg Address, one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered, is barely over 2 minutes long. What history later called brilliance was built through repetition, restraint, and relentless refinement. And that story matters more than we think, because most of us quietly assume that articulation is something we either have or we don't. We watch someone explain an idea clearly and think they're just naturally good at speaking. Meanwhile, we replay our own conversations in our heads. We remember the moment when our sentence drifted off, when we over-explained, when we said less than we meant. And without realizing it, we start forming a belief. Maybe we're just not wired for this. But what if that belief is the first misunderstanding? Most of the time, when our words collapse, it's not a lack of intelligence, it's misalignment. The thought exists, the feeling exists, but the delivery system breaks under pressure. Notice what happens inside us right before we speak in a moment that matters. The body tightens slightly, the breath becomes shallow, the mind speeds up. We start thinking about how we're being perceived instead of what we're actually trying to say, and that subtle shift pulls us away from clarity. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." When we speak, that line becomes surprisingly practical. The tension we feel is often not about the words themselves, but about the imagined consequences of those words. We project judgment, we anticipate criticism, and the brain, sensing risk, narrows its focus. That narrowing is the real disruption. Under stress, working memory shrinks. The mental workspace where we organize ideas becomes crowded. Instead of thinking in complete structures, we scramble for fragments. That's why a thought that felt organized seconds earlier suddenly feels scattered. And here's the quiet truth. The people who seem articulate are not free from this reaction. Their nervous systems activate too. Their hearts race too. The difference is not the absence of pressure. It's their relationship with it. They've trained themselves to slow down internally before speaking externally. They've practiced organizing thoughts in simple frameworks. They've learned to breathe in a way that steadies the voice. They've built language patterns that feel natural instead of forced. Articulation, then, is not decoration. It's control. Control over attention, control over rhythm, control over the space between thought and speech. Look at daily life, and you'll see it everywhere. There's always someone in the room who doesn't speak the most, yet when they do, the room shifts slightly. People listen, not because the words are complicated, but because they're clean, direct, complete. There's no scrambling behind them, no apology wrapped around them. That steadiness can be built. And if we're honest, most of us don't want to sound impressive. We want to feel aligned. We want our ideas to come out the way they exist inside. We want to stop replaying conversations and thinking about what we should have said. So the real question isn't, how do we sound smarter? The real question is, what is happening inside us when we speak? And how do we guide it instead of being guided by it? Because once we understand that internal system, something changes. The fear loses its mystery, the hesitation loses its grip, and speaking stops feeling like exposure and starts feeling like extension. And that's where we begin. When we think about why our words sometimes fall apart under pressure, We usually blame confidence. We tell ourselves we need to be more confident, as if confidence were something we could summon on demand. But if we look carefully at what actually happens inside us, the story becomes more precise and more useful. Imagine the moment just before we speak in a setting that matters. It might be a meeting, an interview, a difficult conversation. The idea is there, clear, structured. We know what we want to say. And then attention turns toward us. Something shifts. The breath becomes shallow. The chest tightens slightly. The mind speeds up. Instead of focusing purely on the idea, we start thinking about how we're being perceived. Are we sounding smart enough? Are we making sense? Are they judging us? That internal pivot from expression to self-monitoring is the real disruption. William James once suggested that our emotional states are deeply tied to our physical responses. When the body shifts, the mind follows. Under perceived pressure, the nervous system activates. Cortisol rises. Adrenaline sharpens the senses. And while that response is brilliant for survival, it's not optimized for nuanced thinking. Here's what that means practically. Working memory, the mental space where we hold and organize thoughts, narrows under stress. It doesn't disappear. It shrinks. And when that space shrinks, the sentence we were about to deliver loses structure. We reach for fragments instead of complete ideas. We over-explain because we're trying to compensate, or we rush because the body wants resolution. We interpret this as incompetence, but it's simply biology operating without regulation. The people who appear calm and articulate are not exempt from this activation. Their nervous systems respond too. Their heart rates increase too. The difference lies in what happens next. They recognize the activation without panicking about it. They allow it to exist without letting it take control. And that ability can be trained. Start with something deceptively simple. Breathing before speaking, not dramatically, not visibly, just one slower inhale, one controlled exhale. That small adjustment signals safety to the nervous system. It widens the mental workspace again. Thoughts stabilize. Then comes structure. Instead of speaking the moment an idea appears, we pause for half a second and internally shape it. What is the core point? What is the simplest way to state it? When we discipline ourselves to finish the thought in the mind before releasing it into the room, clarity increases immediately. Notice something subtle in daily life. The people who communicate clearly rarely rush to fill silence. They allow space. That space is not hesitation, it's processing. It gives their words weight because the sentence arrives complete, not assembled in real time. Articulation begins there, not with impressive vocabulary, not with louder tone, but with internal steadiness. When we stop fighting the activation and start guiding it, something changes. The pressure doesn't disappear, it becomes manageable. The mind doesn't blank, it organizes, and the words don't scramble, they land. So before we try to upgrade our language or polish our delivery, we have to understand this foundation. Because if pressure narrows us, the next question becomes unavoidable. What are we telling ourselves in that moment? And how much power does that inner voice really have? If pressure narrows the mind, then the next layer is quieter and more powerful. What are we telling ourselves in that moment? Right before we speak, there's usually a whisper running in the background. It's subtle, almost automatic. Sometimes it sounds like, "Don't mess this up," or "Make sure this sounds smart," or "They probably already know more than you." We don't consciously choose those thoughts. They appear. And once they appear, They begin shaping everything: posture, tone, pacing, even word choice. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." In communication, the clarity of your speech depends upon them just as much. Think about it carefully. If the internal message is, "I need to impress them," the body tightens, the sentence becomes overloaded. We start adding extra words, qualifiers, disclaimers. We hedge, we soften, we rush. Not because we lack ideas, but because we're trying to manage perception instead of expressing truth. If the internal message is, "I don't belong here," the tone subtly drops. The delivery loses firmness. Even strong ideas come out sounding tentative. The inner voice doesn't just affect what we say, it affects how we say it. And here's the deeper issue. Most of us have inherited that voice. It was shaped by past embarrassment, criticism, comparison, school experiences, early social feedback. The brain stores those moments as protective patterns. The next time we speak, it tries to prevent risk. The intention is protection. The outcome is limitation. But the voice itself is not the enemy. It's just unexamined. Notice something simple in everyday life. When we speak to a close friend, someone we trust, our words flow more easily. The structure is clearer. The tone is natural. We don't over-edit mid-sentence. Why? Because the inner voice is quiet. There's no performance pressure. So the goal is not to eliminate self-awareness. It's to replace self-criticism with contribution. Instead of entering a moment thinking, "How do I sound?" we shift to, "What value am I adding?" Instead of asking, "Are they judging me?" we ask, "Is this clear?" That shift sounds small, but internally it reorganizes attention. When attention moves from self-image to message clarity, articulation improves immediately. There's another layer to this. The mind cannot organize complex thought while simultaneously defending against imagined judgment. It's too much load. When we reduce internal conflict, cognitive bandwidth frees up. Ideas connect more smoothly. Sentences arrive more complete. This is why articulate people often appear calm. It's not that they don't care. It's that their mental energy is pointed outward, toward the idea, not inward toward insecurity, and that redirection can be practiced. Before speaking, instead of rehearsing the perfect sentence, we rehearse the intention. What is the one thing I want understood? If that single point is clear internally, the wording becomes secondary. The delivery stabilizes. Articulation at this level becomes psychological alignment. The body may activate, the room may feel intense, but if the inner voice is steady, focused on contribution instead of evaluation, clarity survives the pressure. And once that voice is aligned, something interesting happens. The body starts to follow. Because thought influences breath. Breath influences tone. Tone influences presence, which means the next layer isn't mental at all, it's physical. If the mind shapes the message, the body shapes how that message is received. We don't always realize this, but long before a single word leaves our mouth, our body has already started speaking. The posture, the shoulders, the breathing pattern, the pace at which we move, all of it sends signals. And those signals don't just influence the audience, they influence us. William James once observed that the body and the mind are not separate systems. They are constantly informing each other. Change the body and the mind shifts. Change the breath and the emotional state follows. Think about the last time you felt confident while speaking. Your breathing was probably deeper. Your shoulders weren't collapsed forward. Your voice had space behind it. Now think about a moment when you felt unsure. The chest tightened. The breath shortened. The voice rose slightly in pitch. The words rushed. The message might have been the same, but the delivery felt different. This is where articulation moves from psychology into physiology. When we breathe shallowly from the upper chest, the voice loses resonance. It becomes thinner, faster, less grounded. And because the nervous system interprets shallow breathing as urgency, the mind stays in a reactive state. But when we breathe lower, slower inhale through the nose, controlled exhale, something subtle changes. The parasympathetic nervous system activates. The body stabilizes. The voice gains depth. Words begin to land with more weight. You can test this immediately. Speak a sentence after holding tension in your shoulders and tightening your jaw. Then release the shoulders, unclench the jaw, take a full breath, and speak again. The difference isn't dramatic, it's controlled, and control is what creates authority. Posture works the same way. An upright, relaxed posture doesn't just look confident, it expands lung capacity. It allows fuller breath support. It prevents the throat from constricting. That mechanical shift alone can transform vocal steadiness. Aristotle wrote that persuasion rests on three pillars: logos, ethos, and pathos, logic, credibility, and emotion. We often focus entirely on logic, but credibility, ethos, is deeply physical. People trust steadiness. They trust calm rhythm. They trust vocal control. Notice something in everyday life. The person who commands attention in a room rarely waves their hands wildly or speaks the fastest. Their gestures are measured. Their movements have intention. There's space between their sentences. That space doesn't feel awkward. It feels controlled. Pauses are part of articulation. When we rush to fill silence, we communicate internal urgency. When we allow a beat after a sentence, we communicate completion. That pause tells the listener the thought is finished. It doesn't need rescuing. And here's something most people miss. Your body doesn't have to be dramatic to be effective. You don't need exaggerated gestures or theatrical movement. You need congruence. If your words are calm, but your body is tense, the audience feels the mismatch. If your message is strong but your posture collapses, the strength weakens. Articulation is alignment. Again, alignment between thought and body, between breath and rhythm, between intention and movement. And once the body stabilizes, something powerful happens. The mind stops scrambling to compensate, which raises the next question naturally. If we regulate the nervous system, if we quiet the inner voice, if we steady the body, then what remains is language itself. And that's where precision begins. If the mind is steady and the body is grounded, then what finally reaches the room is language. And language is not neutral. The words we choose don't just transfer information, they shape perception, they frame reality, they decide whether a conversation opens or closes. Think about something simple. In a meeting, you could say, "That won't work." The sentence is direct, technically clear, but it immediately tightens the atmosphere. Defenses rise, the exchange becomes competitive. Now compare that to, "I see it differently. Can I walk you through my reasoning?" The disagreement is still there. The substance hasn't changed, but the emotional temperature of the room is different. One version creates friction, the other creates dialogue. That difference is articulation at work. Nietzsche once wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." Whether or not we agree completely with that statement, in communication it reveals something important. The way we frame an idea determines how it's received. Words act as lenses. When we describe a problem as a failure, it carries weight. When we describe it as a setback, it feels temporary. When we call feedback criticism, it feels personal. When we call it data, it feels usable. The meaning shifts, and with it, the emotional reaction. Articulation is not about using bigger words. In fact, overcomplication often weakens clarity. Lincoln's strength wasn't in elaborate vocabulary, it was in restraint. He removed what diluted the core idea. Most of us do the opposite under pressure. We add extra phrases, we hedge, we say, "I think maybe we should consider possibly," instead of, "I recommend we do this." We soften our sentences because we're managing perception, but in doing so, we weaken structure. Precision builds credibility. Notice how different these two statements feel. "I'm not sure, but maybe this could work." "I believe this is the strongest option." Same speaker, same idea, different weight. Filler language, like, sort of, kind of, may feel harmless, but it subtly trains the mind toward vagueness. When language becomes imprecise, thinking follows, and when thinking is imprecise, delivery becomes unstable. Articulation requires discipline in word choice. It means finishing the thought internally before speaking it. It means choosing verbs that are active instead of passive. It means removing excess so that the core message stands clean. And this doesn't only apply to professional settings. In everyday life, the way we frame our own experiences matters too. Saying, "I always mess this up," reinforces identity. Saying, "That didn't go the way I wanted," keeps the event separate from the self. One traps us. The other leaves space for growth. Language shapes both how others see us and how we see ourselves. The articulate person is not the one with the largest vocabulary. It's the one who can find the right word for the moment, the word that fits naturally, the sentence that lands without apology. And once words become intentional, something else becomes clear. Even perfectly chosen language can fall flat if the rhythm is wrong. Because articulation is not only about what we say, it's about how it sounds when it arrives. If the words are precise, the next layer is how those words travel through the air. Because even the clearest sentence can lose its force if the voice behind it is rushed, strained, or uncertain. Most people think of the voice as something fixed, a trait we're born with. But the voice is an instrument, and like any instrument, it can be tuned. Listen carefully to someone who speaks with authority. The volume isn't necessarily louder, the tone isn't theatrical. What stands out is control. There's steadiness, there's variation, there's space. The breath sits lower. The pace isn't frantic. The sentence finishes before the next one begins. In everyday life, we rarely notice rhythm consciously, but we feel it. When someone speaks too fast, we feel pressure. When someone speaks too slowly without intention, we feel drift. When someone varies their pace naturally, slowing slightly at key moments, allowing silence after a strong idea, we feel engagement. Silence in particular is misunderstood. Many of us rush to fill it. The second a pause appears, we panic and add extra words. But a well-placed pause is not hesitation, it's emphasis. It gives the listener time to process. It signals confidence. It tells the room that the thought is complete and doesn't need rescuing. Churchill famously marked pauses in his speeches, not because he forgot what to say, but because he understood that rhythm carries meaning. A sentence delivered without breath feels different than the same sentence delivered with control. And this is practical. Before speaking, take a fuller inhale. Let the exhale carry the first phrase. Allow the voice to resonate instead of forcing it. If you feel yourself accelerating, Consciously slow the next sentence by a fraction, not dramatically, just enough to regain control. Notice in daily conversation how someone who finishes their sentences cleanly feels more grounded. There's no upward lift at the end as if asking permission. The tone settles instead of escaping. Pitch, pace, and pause are the invisible architecture of articulation. Even emphasis matters. When every word carries the same weight, nothing stands out. But when key words are slightly stressed, not exaggerated, just intentional, the message gains structure. The listener knows where to anchor attention. And here's something subtle. The voice often reflects internal state before we realize it. If we're tense, the jaw tightens. If we're anxious, the pitch rises. If we're uncertain, the tone softens. But when the breath is steady and the posture is aligned, the voice naturally stabilizes. Articulation at this level becomes musical, not dramatic, not performative, but deliberate. The words are chosen carefully. The breath supports them. The rhythm guides them. And the listener doesn't just understand the message, they feel its steadiness. Which leads to something interesting. When the voice is controlled and the language is precise, communication stops being a one-way performance. It becomes a shared space. And that shared space depends on something even more powerful than speaking well. It depends on listening. If articulation were only about speaking, it would feel like performance. But the strongest communicators don't dominate conversations. They deepen them. And that shift begins with something most people underestimate. Listening, not waiting for your turn, not nodding while preparing your counterpoint, but actually listening. Stephen Covey once wrote, "Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply." That sentence cuts deeper than it first appears. Because when we're focused on replying, we're mentally elsewhere. We're constructing, defending, positioning. And in doing so, we miss the structure of what's being said to us. Articulation is not just clarity in expression, it's accuracy in response. When someone speaks, they're not only delivering information, they're revealing priorities, concerns, emotions, assumptions. If we don't hear those layers, our response lands slightly off. And when a response lands off, the conversation loses alignment. Think about everyday moments. A colleague explains a frustration. If we respond with a solution too quickly, they may feel dismissed. If we reflect back what we heard, "It sounds like you're frustrated because the timeline keeps shifting." Something changes. The conversation slows. The other person feels seen, and once they feel understood, they're more receptive to what we say next. Listening sharpens articulation because it reduces guesswork. When we truly understand the context, we don't over-explain, we don't hedge unnecessarily, we don't defend against threats that aren't present. Our words become precise because they're tailored. There's also a neurological shift here. When we feel heard, our nervous system settles. The same applies to others. A calm system processes language more openly than a defensive one, so listening isn't passive. It actively creates the psychological conditions for your words to matter. Notice something subtle. The most articulate people often ask clear questions before offering strong statements, not as a tactic, as calibration. They want to understand the landscape before stepping into it. Questions like, what outcome are we aiming for? What concerns you most about this? Can you clarify what you mean by that? Those questions don't weaken authority, they refine it, because articulation without listening becomes monologue, and monologue rarely persuades. Listening also changes the tone of disagreement. When someone feels heard, disagreement feels like dialogue instead of attack. The room stays open, and there's a deeper benefit. When we listen fully, we buy ourselves time. Time to think, time to organize, time to respond deliberately instead of reactively. That pause strengthens structure. So articulation at this level becomes relational. It's no longer about sounding impressive. It's about building understanding. The clearer we hear, the clearer we speak. And once we understand how to listen deeply, a new challenge emerges naturally, because not all conversations are easy. Some carry tension, some carry conflict, some carry stakes. And how we handle those moments determines whether our articulation collapses or becomes leadership. If listening creates alignment, difficult conversations test it. Because it's one thing to speak clearly when the atmosphere is calm. It's another thing entirely when tension enters the room. We've all been there. A disagreement surfaces, a deadline was missed, expectations weren't met. Or maybe it's something personal, a boundary that needs to be set, a truth that needs to be said. The stakes feel higher, the emotional temperature rises, and suddenly everything we've practiced feels fragile. This is where articulation either dissolves or becomes leadership. Most difficult conversations fail before they begin, not because of what's said, but because of the state we enter them in. If we walk in focused on winning, proving, defending, the nervous system tightens. The tone sharpens. The language becomes absolute. Words like always and never appear, and the conversation turns into a contest. But if we walk in focused on clarity and outcome, something shifts. Epictetus once reminded his students that we cannot control external events, only our judgments about them. In hard conversations, that principle becomes practical. We cannot control the other person's reaction. But we can control our preparation. We can control our structure. We can control our tone. Preparation matters more than spontaneity here. Before entering a tense discussion, it helps to clarify three things internally. What is the core issue? What outcome am I aiming for? And what tone will serve that outcome best? Without that clarity, we drift. We over-explain. We react to reactions. In everyday life, notice how quickly conflict escalates when we speak in accusation instead of observation. You never listen triggers defense. But I feel unheard when the topic changes mid-sentence, invites response. The meaning may overlap. The structure changes the impact. Articulation in conflict is about containment. Containment of emotion. Containment of language. Containment of pace. When emotions rise, speed tends to increase, so slowing down becomes strategic. A deliberate pause after a strong sentence gives the room space to process. It prevents escalation. It signals control, and control breeds credibility. It's also important to recognize that silence in difficult conversations can be powerful. Not silent avoidance, but intentional space. When someone reacts emotionally, resisting the urge to interrupt often stabilizes the dynamic. People calm down faster when they feel fully expressed. Leadership in conversation doesn't come from volume, it comes from steadiness. The articulate person in tense moments is not the one who speaks the most forcefully. It's the one who speaks the most precisely, the one who chooses words that address the issue without attacking identity. And here's the quiet truth. Most people fear difficult conversations because they fear losing control. But when we regulate our internal state, structure our thoughts clearly, and speak with measured tone, control increases rather than decreases. The conversation may still be uncomfortable, But discomfort doesn't have to mean chaos. And when we learn to handle tension without losing clarity, something interesting happens. Our presence changes. People begin to trust us more, not because we avoid conflict, but because we navigate it without collapse. Which leads naturally to the next layer. If clarity under pressure builds credibility, what builds influence? If clarity under pressure builds credibility, influence builds something deeper. Because at some point, articulation is no longer about delivering a clean sentence. It's about moving something, a perspective, a decision, a direction. And influence, at its core, is not force. It's resonance. We've all experienced it. Someone speaks, and it doesn't feel like they're pushing. It feels like they understand the room. They're aware of the emotional undercurrent. They're not trying to overpower. They're trying to align. That alignment begins with respect. Aristotle described persuasion as resting on three pillars: logic, emotion, and credibility. Most of us overemphasize logic. We gather arguments, we build explanations, we stack evidence, but people rarely change their minds because they've been cornered by information. They shift when they feel safe enough to reconsider. That safety is emotional. Notice something in daily life. When someone challenges you directly, "You're wrong about this," the body reacts. The shoulders stiffen. The mind prepares defense. But when someone says, "Help me understand how you see this," the body softens. The mind opens. The content of the disagreement may be the same. The emotional entry point is different. Influence without emotional intelligence feels like pressure. Influence with emotional intelligence feels like invitation. And invitation requires restraint. It requires us to listen fully before speaking, to frame ideas in ways that connect to the other person's priorities, to use language that expands rather than attacks. Even small shifts matter. Instead of "this won't work," we might say, "I see a potential risk here." Instead of "you're overlooking this," we might say, "Can we consider this angle as well?" These aren't tricks. They're adjustments that preserve dignity, and dignity keeps conversations open. There's also something subtle about timing. Influence rarely happens in the first sentence. It builds through sequence. First clarity, then understanding, then shared ground. Only after that does persuasion land naturally. The most articulate people understand this rhythm. They don't rush to the conclusion. They guide the path toward it. And here's the deeper truth. When our intention is to win, we narrow. When our intention is to elevate the conversation, we expand. That expansion changes tone. It changes pacing. It changes word choice. And it changes how others receive us. Influence becomes less about domination and more about trust. Look at leaders who command loyalty. They're not always the loudest. They're often the clearest and the most emotionally aware. They know when to press and when to pause, when to speak firmly and when to soften the edge. Articulation at this level becomes strategic awareness. It's not just about what you say. It's about when you say it, and how the other person feels while hearing it. And once we understand influence, something else becomes unavoidable. Because no matter how skilled we become, there will be moments when pressure spikes again. The room gets bigger, the stakes rise, the spotlight intensifies, and then the question becomes, can we turn that pressure into fuel instead of friction? When the spotlight grows brighter and the stakes rise, something familiar happens inside us. The heart accelerates. The hands feel slightly colder. The breath shortens again. It's the same activation we've talked about before, but amplified. and most of us interpret it the wrong way. We feel the surge and think, "I'm nervous." We assume the nerves mean weakness. We try to suppress the sensation. But here's a quieter truth. That surge is energy. Adrenaline does not arrive to sabotage us. It arrives to sharpen focus. It heightens awareness. It increases oxygen flow. The body is preparing for performance. The difference between collapse and command often lies in interpretation. Psychologists have found that when people reframe anxiety as excitement, performance improves. The physiological pattern is nearly identical: elevated heart rate, increased alertness, but the meaning attached to it changes the outcome. Instead of saying internally, "I'm nervous," we can say, "My body is preparing." That shift is not cosmetic. It redirects attention. Because when we fight activation, we add tension on top of tension. But when we allow it, when we stand steady and let the energy exist, the mind stabilizes faster. Think about athletes before competition. The calmest ones are not relaxed in the way we imagine. They're alert, focused, activated, but they've trained their relationship with that activation. The same applies to speaking. Before a high-stakes moment, a presentation, a difficult conversation, a public address, instead of trying to eliminate nerves, we anchor them. One deeper breath, feet planted firmly, shoulders relaxed but upright. We remind ourselves, this energy is usable. And once we stop resisting it, something interesting happens. The voice gains intensity without strain. The pace becomes intentional. The eyes stay steady. The energy becomes propulsion instead of friction. There's another layer here too. Pressure narrows attention. So under high stakes, we simplify. Instead of trying to say everything, we focus on the one core message that must land. Clarity under pressure is not about expansion. It's about precision. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address worked not because it covered every argument of the Civil War, but because it distilled the meaning of the moment. Fewer words, greater impact. Under pressure, simplicity wins. And this reframing changes how we see high-stakes environments. They're no longer threats to survive. They're arenas to channel intensity. When we trust our preparation, regulate the body, steady the inner voice, and simplify the message, pressure becomes something we ride, not something that rides us. And once that shift becomes consistent, articulation stops feeling like a skill we occasionally access. It becomes part of our identity, which leads to the final layer. Because at some point, this isn't about techniques anymore. It's about who we decide to become every time we open our mouth. At some point, all of this stops being technique. It stops being about breathing methods, word choice, pauses, posture, reframing nerves. Those tools matter, but they're scaffolding. The deeper shift happens when articulation becomes part of how we see ourselves. Because identity quietly governs behavior. If we internally believe, "I'm not good at speaking," that belief will shape every conversation. It will influence tone before we notice it. It will limit structure before the sentence forms. The brain protects consistency. It will subconsciously produce behavior that matches the identity we've accepted. But if we begin to see ourselves differently, not as performers, not as impressors, but as contributors, something recalibrates. Instead of asking, "How do I sound?" we ask, "Is this clear?" Instead of asking, "Will they approve?" we ask, "Is this aligned with what I believe?" That shift is quiet, but it's decisive. Articulation at the highest level is integrity in motion, thought, breath, tone and language aligned with internal clarity. No performance, no overcompensation, no apology for existing. When we trust our preparation, regulate our body, discipline our language, and listen before responding, we're no longer trying to appear articulate. We simply are. And here's something important. Articulate people are not flawless speakers. They still pause. They still correct themselves. They still refine mid-sentence. The difference is that they don't collapse when it happens. They remain steady. They don't interpret imperfection as exposure. They understand that clarity is iterative. Over time, repetition compounds. Conversations become practice. Meetings become rehearsal. Difficult moments become training grounds. Just as Lincoln refined his words through revision, we refine our voice through use. And slowly, something changes. We stop replaying conversations in our heads. We stop wishing we had said something differently. We begin leaving rooms feeling complete instead of fragmented. That's the real measure. Not applause, not approval, but alignment. When what we think matches what we say, and what we say matches how we say it, confidence stops being something we chase. It becomes a byproduct. And maybe that's the deeper point behind all of this. Articulation isn't about sounding impressive. It's about reducing the distance between who we are internally and how we show up externally. When that distance shrinks, presence strengthens. And when presence strengthens, our words carry weight. Not because they are louder, but because they are grounded. That's where clarity becomes influence. That's where influence becomes trust. And that's where speaking stops feeling like exposure and starts feeling like extension. There's one more layer most people never talk about. Consistency. Because anyone can speak well once. Anyone can prepare, rehearse, regulate their breath, choose precise words, and deliver a strong message in a single high-stakes moment. But articulation becomes powerful when it stops being situational and becomes habitual. The real transformation happens when we practice clarity in small, ordinary conversations, not just important ones. Think about how we respond to simple questions during the day. How was your week? What do you think about this idea? Can you explain that again? These moments seem minor, but they are training grounds. If we ramble casually, we train rambling. If we rush casually, we train rushing. If we speak vaguely in low-stakes settings, we reinforce vagueness under pressure. Habits compound quietly. Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. The same applies to communication. Articulation is not a performance switch. It's a repeated standard. This is why the most articulate people don't suddenly transform when the spotlight hits them. They speak clearly in everyday life. They answer questions directly. They finish thoughts cleanly. They pause naturally. They've built rhythm into their default state. There's something powerful about that. When clarity becomes your baseline, pressure doesn't create chaos. It simply increases intensity. And consistency isn't about perfection. It's about awareness. After conversations, instead of replaying them with regret, we can replay them with curiosity. Where did I rush? Where did I lose structure? Where did I overqualify? That reflection isn't self-criticism, it's calibration. Just like Lincoln revising drafts, we refine through iteration. There's another dimension to consistency too, emotional steadiness. If our articulation changes dramatically based on mood, people struggle to trust our presence. But when our tone remains measured, whether the moment is casual or tense, we create psychological safety, and safety builds credibility. Notice leaders who feel stable. Their speech doesn't spike and collapse unpredictably. Their pacing is recognizable. Their rhythm is familiar. That predictability isn't boring, it's grounding, and grounding creates influence. Consistency also protects identity. When we repeatedly show up with clarity, the inner voice shifts. It stops asking, "Can I handle this?" and starts assuming, "I know how to navigate this." Confidence grows not from single victories, but from accumulated proof. Every clear sentence is proof. Every composed pause is proof. Every difficult conversation handled steadily is proof. Over time, articulation stops feeling like effort. It feels natural. And when something becomes natural, it stops draining energy. Which brings us to the final insight beneath all of this. Articulation is not about speaking more. It's about living in such alignment that when you speak, it feels effortless. And that kind of effortlessness isn't talent. It's training repeated long enough to become identity. And when training becomes identity, something almost invisible begins to happen. We stop speaking to prove ourselves. We start speaking to clarify reality. There's a subtle shift there. For a long time, most of us speak from a defensive place. We want to sound competent, intelligent, worth listening to. Even when we're not aware of it, there's a small layer of performance behind our words. But once articulation becomes internal alignment, the performance drops away. We no longer speak to impress the room. We speak to serve the message. That shift changes everything. The voice relaxes because it's not carrying ego. The pacing stabilizes because it's not chasing approval. The language simplifies because it's not trying to decorate itself. Clarity becomes cleaner. And something powerful happens in the room when someone speaks without performance. People lean in, not because the tone is louder, but because it feels grounded. There's no scramble behind it, no hidden tension, just thought delivered with steadiness. This is where articulation moves beyond skill. It becomes character. When we discipline our breath, refine our language, regulate our inner voice, listen deeply, navigate tension calmly, and show up consistently, we're not just learning to speak better. We're learning to think better, to process better, to respond better. Speech becomes a reflection of mental order, and mental order radiates outward. Look at people whose words carry weight. They don't rush to dominate conversations. They don't fill silence to avoid discomfort. They don't over-explain to defend identity. They speak when there's something worth saying. And when they do, it lands. That kind of presence is quiet power. It doesn't need theatrics. It doesn't need volume. It doesn't need constant validation. It rests on alignment. And maybe that's the real takeaway from everything we've explored. Articulation is not about vocabulary. It's not about charisma. It's not even about confidence in the traditional sense. It's about narrowing the gap between thought and expression. When that gap closes, regret shrinks. Conversations feel complete. The replaying in our heads fades. We leave rooms feeling centered instead of scattered. And over time, the way we speak begins to shape how we're perceived. Not as loud, not as dominant, but as steady. Steadiness builds trust. Trust builds influence. Influence builds opportunity. And all of it begins with something deceptively simple, paying attention to the space between thought and speech, and learning to guide it instead of being pulled by it. When we do that consistently, articulation stops being something we try to perform. It becomes something we embody. And once it's embodied, it doesn't leave us when pressure arrives. It rises with us.